Ladies and gentlemen, please give a sound ovation to Professor Thiong'o.
My talk is called Decolonizing Education Towards a Balanced and Inclusive Education. Since the publication of my book, Decolonizing the Mind, in 1986, I have seen over the years increasing global interest in issues of decolonization in general and matters of the unequal power relationship between languages in particular. This last week, in fact, the same issues and matters took me to Limerick, Munster, in Ireland for a conference celebrating the 125 years since the foundation of the Gaelic League in 1893. The League was dedicated to the revival of Gaelic or Irish, which by then, in its own country, had become subordinate to the dominant English. And today, despite many efforts, including official government support for its revival and use, Irish is still subordinate to English. More Irish people speak and use English than they do Irish. Some of the most iconic Irish writers, Yeats, Joyce, and many others, wrote in English, and they are studied as part of the canon of English literature everywhere. In fact, I cannot think of an English department anywhere in the world, Britain itself, without these writers of Irish origins. They have become some of the greatest contributors to English literature. But this unequal power relationship between the two languages in favor of the English was not always the case. The early English settlers in Ireland, Munster area in particular, gravitated naturally toward the Irish because by all accounts, in the beginnings of the English settlement there, particularly between the 13th and 16th century, the Irish language was actually the more endowed in classical learning. Naturally, those early settlers were drawn to the more vibrant Irish tongue. Their gravitation made sense. Irish was the majority tongue, spoken by those among whom the English planters had settled. But note, London acted. And from 1366, from the Statutes of Kilkenny, it passed yet more edicts and laws in the years that followed. And these laws were reinforcing the use of English, literally criminalizing Irish. These policies were given literally and philosophical rationale by no other than Edmund Spenser, the poet contemporary of Shakespeare, himself a settler in Ireland, in a place called Munster, when in his book, A View of Ireland on the Present Time, published in 1596, he argued that language, and naming systems were the best means of bringing about the erasure of Irish memory. And he said it was always the case that the conqueror makes the conquered learn their language. So the marginal status of Irish in its own land did not come about by some kind of natural evolution of languages. Its decline in its own land was brought about by conscious political acts and educational policies. Ireland, it has been observed, was England's first colony. It became a kind of laboratory for other English settler colonies to follow. But what was true for Ireland and other English colonies was equally so for the entire colonial system, whether Spanish, French, Portuguese, or the Japanese occupation of Korea in 1910 to 1945. It's also true in the case of domestic colonialism, as the Norwegian suppression of the language of Sami people between 1870 and 1970, and the variations of the same in other Scandinavian countries. Suppression of languages of the dominated and the elevation of the language of conquest and domination were an integral to the education system, which came along with conquest and colonial occupations. Linguistic suppression was not for the aesthetic joy of doing so, right? Edmund Spencer, himself a settler in Munster, was clear that the colonization of the Irish language and their naming system would make the Irish forget who they were and thus weaken resistance and therefore make it easier for the English to conquer and subdue them. Language conquest, unlike the military, where the victor must subdue the whole population directly, is actually cheaper but more effective. The conqueror has only to invest in capturing the mind of the elite, who will then spread submission to the rest of the population. So the elite then become, by linguistic conquest, become part of the language army of the conqueror. And this was stated clearly by one called Babington Macaulay, who in his famous 1835 Minutes on Indian Education said almost the same thing in the case of British in India, where he advocated the replacement of Sanskrit and Persian as the language of education with English in order, as he says, and I quote him directly, in order to form a class of, I quote, interpreters between us and the millions we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, in intellect. A variation of this would later be enacted in America by a person called Captain Pratt, who was the founder of the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania, 1823, a kind of boarding school for Native American kids. In 1892, he summed up the philosophy behind the boarding school venture as to kill the Indian in him and save the man. His education program followed the same colonial pattern, uproot a few from their mother tongue, which is spoken by the mass of their people, mold them anew in the language of conquest, and then unleash them on the mass of the governed. In his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney quotes Pierre Fontaine, a founder of the Alliance Française, an institution specifically created in 1883 for the propagation of the national language in the colonies and abroad. And he said, and he was very clear about the goal of the education of the mission. And I quote him, as quoted by Rodney, it was necessary to attach the colonies to the metropole by a very solid psychological bond against the day when their progressive emancipation ends, say maybe with independence, that they be and they remain French in language, thought, and spirit. He was very clear about the role of language in creating this bondage in language, thought, and spirit. The psychological bond of language, thought, and spirit, yes. The goal was very clear. Imperial education policies were meant to create colonies of the mind among the elite of the colonized. And the success of these policies are undeniable. A variation of the Irish situation, where even after independence, the intellectuals express themselves more fluently in the language of imperial conquest than in the languages emanating from their own country. And despite all the history and culture it may carry, is present in every post-colonial situation, which means in the globe today. In the case of Africa, you even hear the identity of the continent being described in terms of Europhonity. So you hear of Anglophone country, Francophone, and Lusophone mainly. Even where the elite are very nationalistic and assertive of their independence, they find it easier to express their outrage and hopes, but in the language of imperial conquest. 90% of the monies allocated for language education goes to pamper imperial languages. If you compare the percentage for African languages and percent for English languages, there's no comparison. And yet, in the case of Africa, 90% of the population still speaks African languages. Some governments even view African languages as enemies of progress. They believe that imperial languages are really the gateway to global modernity. Under normal circumstances, it would sound actually very odd to hear that, for instance, French literature can only be written in Japanese, right? Or English literature is that which is written in isiZulu. So that when you meet a French writer who writes in French, you look at them in surprise and say, oh, why on earth are you writing in French? or an English writer writing in English, and you ask, why are you not writing in Zulu? And yet this absurdity is expected, say, of African writers or writers from the formerly colonized. So the question is, how did this absurdity come about? It's not that those languages are more, it's not that those languages, say English, Spanish, or are more of languages than any other. And under any circumstances, to know more languages, to add to what one has, can only empower that person. So there's absolutely nothing wrong in acquiring many languages, including English, Spanish, and others. But this was not the case in a colonial context or any context of the dominating and dominated. It was never a case of adding a new language to what was one already had. For the colonial conqueror, it was not enough to introduce an additional language to any community. Imperial languages had to be planted on the graveyard of the languages of the dominated. The death of, say, African languages gave life to European languages. That is, in order for the imperial language to be, the languages of the colonized must cease to be. So you get a kind of amnesia, forget for African languages, and the opposite, anamnesis for European languages, Oh, African, oh, I don't know how to say this in African languages, Oh, but in English I can say, oh, wonderful, right? But these two conditions induce amnesia for African languages and anamnesis for European languages are not inherent in the character of the languages involved. They are simply mental conditions consciously brought about by how the imperial languages were imposed. In my book, Decolonize the Mind, I've talked about the corporal punishment meted to African children caught speaking an African language in a school compound, and then made to carry a placard around the neck proclaiming their stupidity for speaking their mother tongue. In some cases, the culprit was made to swallow filth, and thus associating African languages with criminality, pain, and filth. And so it's not just Africa. In his testimony to the 2015 testimony to the Waitangi Commission about his experience of school in New Zealand, Dover Samuels, a Maori politician, tells a story of similar experience that I have described in my books. He said in a commission that caught speaking Maori in a school, he said, and I quote him, "You would be hurled out in front of the rest of the class and told to bend over. You'd bend over, and he, the teacher, would stand back and give you what we called then 6 of the best. On many occasions, not only did it leave bruises behind on my thighs, but drew blood. Drew blood for a child caught speaking their mother tongue." The Sami people of Norway went through a similar experience in the period between 1870 and 1970, what they call the brutal century, in an attempt to turn them into fluent Norwegian language speakers. I must add quickly that today, Norway supports Sami language, okay? Yeah. Similar violence against native languages is the running theme in the spread of English in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. In Wales, those that spoke Welsh in a school compound were made to stand in front of the class with a placard, "Welsh not," hanging from their necks. It is the same story in the languages of education for Native American children, Native Australians, and Native Pacific peoples. Captain Pratt's formula, "kill the Indian in him and save the man," was the philosophical raison d'etre in the education system of the colonial system itself. Violence was central in creating the psychological bond of language, culture, and thought, or what I like to call colonies of the mind. Now, you would think that after liberation, that is independence, the new nations, at the very least, would dismantle that unequal power relationship and restore some measure of normality or balance. But that is precisely the power of the colonies of the mind. Negativity towards self, negativity towards self has become internalized into a way of looking at reality. It is a classic case of conditioning that you'll find in manuals of behavior psychology. Conditioning is a system of rewards and punishment. Punishment for the undesired behavior and rewards for the desired one. It's often used in various degrees of intensity in the bringing up children or, breaking animals into domestic docility. The undesired behavior becomes associated with punishment and hence pain. The desired behavior with reward and hence pleasure. The object of conditioning, be it a child or an animal, comes to automatically avoid the space of pain. Oh no. That is the undesired behavior. And it gravitates towards the space of pleasure, the desired behavior. In the case of learning, one became the recipient of glory for excelling in a language of conquest, and the recipient of blood, gory mess, for uttering even a single word in one's mother tongue. One's mother tongue became the space of pain to be avoided, and the conquering language, the space of pleasure to be desired. It was a contest between glory and gory. And you identify with glory, not the gory on your blood, on your body, as described in the testimony of the Maori politician cited above. In the end, the conditioned develops a Pavlovian consciousness. You know about Pavlov and experiments with dogs. Yeah. In the end, the conditioned develops a Pavlovian consciousness where the sound associated with reward or punishment alone can bring about the salivation, salivate in anticipation of the pleasurable space or desalination at the process of pain. In the case, say, of English, the sound of English or the dominant makes the mouth salivate with desire. English, good. The sound of the other mother tongue makes the mouth dry up. Oh, how can I say it? The trauma experienced by the first generation of the conditioned can be passed on as normal behavior that needs no explanation or justification. The later generation may not even understand why they associate those qualities to the two sets of languages and cultures. In the case of language, the elite and educational planners of the formerly colonized societies assume that European languages, and not just all European languages, imperial languages, are inherently global, inherently best able to carry intelligence and universality. It may also explain why criminalizing African languages continues to this day. I know in schools in Africa today where they are again beaten in the school compound, for speaking after their mother tongue, criminalizing the mother tongue, right? Today, I'm not talking about the yesterday, okay? Now, so it may explain why, and if you ask why are they doing this, they won't be able to explain because there's no correlation whatsoever, between learning a new language and abandoning the old one. There's no correlation. Otherwise, if today you go and learn French, you have to give up English or Spanish or whatever. There's no pedagogical correlation between the two, okay? They just do it. They don't ask why. So, and they don't see the irony. An African punishing another African for speaking an African language and with the approval of an African government and parents, if I may add. The trauma initially wrought by the education system or the colonial situation is passed on, inherited. So the result is abnormality, because abnormal becomes normalized as the normal. And the normalized abnormality is now nationalized as a desirable national goal of education. Abnormality, a normalized abnormality, okay, becomes the foundation of what they call national education. So the colony of the mind prevents meaningful, nationally empowering innovations in education. But the pattern emerging in the context of the colonized and colonized is actually inherent in the education systems in any structures or inequality. Education may become a process of mystifying the cognitive process and even knowledge itself. Here, we need to make a distinction between education and knowledge. Knowledge is simply a question of continuously adding to what we already know. A system of here to there and there to here in a dialectical play of mutual impact and illumination. The normal cognitive process starts from the known to the unknown, but every new step makes the unknown known and therefore adds to what is already known. The new known enriches the already known, and so on in a continuous journey of making dialectically related connections. Knowledge of the world simply begins where one is, one's body, one's community, one's languages, and then you connect. There's no mystery. Education, on the other hand, is really a mode of conditioning a person to make them fit into and function in a given society. It may involve transference of knowledge, but it's often conditioned knowledge, branded by the world outlook of the educator and the world outlook of the education system itself. A careful study of the colonial process as a particular instance of the dominating and the dominated, master and servant, a process inherent in all structural inequality, can be useful in thinking about balanced and inclusive education. The colonial education was never balanced, was never inclusive, and was never innovative. So it's a question of drawing lessons from the negative, not copying the negative. The colonial process was always a negation of the normal cognitive process. Imperial Europe, its name, its geography, its history, and knowledge was always seen at the starting point of the educational journey of the colonized. In short, colonization in the area of education was always predicted on the negation of the colonized own space at the starting point of knowledge. In the area of languages, it meant a negation of native languages as valid sources of knowledge, intellectual and artistic inquiry. Education and the acquisition of knowledge becomes a mystification of the relation between here and there. Lack of roots in one's base creates a state of permanent uncertainty about one's relations to wherever we are, to our abilities, our achievements even. So decolonization must be at the heart of any balanced and inclusive education. For both the formally colonizing and the formally colonized are impacted by the colonial system that has shaped the modern world for the last 400 years or 500 years. Decolonization has to mean, decolonization not only for the formally colonized, it's also important for the formally colonizing. Yeah. And decolonization has to be the negation of the colonial process. Knowledge starts where and wherever we are. Our languages are, in fact, not all languages are valid sources of knowledge. We all love the stars, but we don't have to first migrate to Europe, physically or metaphorically, in order to reach the stars. In my other book, Globalectics, Theory and Politics of Knowing, I've talked about the necessity of globalectic imagination in acquisition, application of knowledge. In the case of languages, we have to reject the commonly held wisdom that the problem in any one country or in the world is the existence of many languages and cultures and even religions. The problem is their relation in terms of hierarchy. Even elsewhere, not here, I would describe monolingualism as the carbon monoxide of cultures, and multilingualism as the oxygen of cultures. So the problem with language is not their numbers, it's their relationship in terms of hierarchy. My language is higher than yours. My language is higher than yours. Or my language is global, yours is local. So we talk about global languages and local languages. Why? Is there a language inherently global? Another one which is inherently local? And in order for you to know my language, you must give up yours. The view that my God is more of a God than your God is actually very ungodly. This view leads some people to see their own languages as inherently more of languages than other languages, and therefore must be ranked higher in order of knowledge and power, what I've described elsewhere as linguistic feudalism. All languages, big and small, have a lot to contribute to our common humanity if freed from linguistic feudalism. Educational policies should be devised on the basis that all languages are treasuries of histories, beauty, and possibility. They have something to give to each other if their relationship is that of the give and take of a network. Even if one of the languages should emerge as a language of communication across the many languages, it should not be on the basis of its assumed inherent nationness or globality, but on the basis of need and necessity. And even then, it should not grow on the graveyard of other languages. Balanced and inclusive education calls for a new slogan, which I like to adopt. Network, not hierarchy. Network, network is wonderful, you give to each other. Hierarchy is when you sit on somebody else. It's still a linkage, but one's hierarchy, the other is network. Very different, okay? So network, not hierarchy. In the case of languages, we have to understand that all languages, big and small, have one common language. All languages, while they speak a common language, they already have one, and it's called translation. And I want to show you very briefly. Can I show the link? The story is really my story called The Upright Revolution. I wrote in the Gecko language. And now it has been translated into 74 languages in the world, okay? Let's scroll down, and they are all on one page, so website, so you can see them in terms of the different languages. I want to do one little test at the very end. Towards the end. And you can go to the website yourself and look at them. And yeah, that one. Before you do that, yeah. Hold a second. Do you see? Can you see that language? Okay. Yeah. Do you see that language? Tun Savi. I want to do a little test. How many know that language? Where does it come from? Huh? Please, among the people who are here. Huh? Where is the language from? Right? Yeah. Good. He gets 100%. It's a Mexican language. And I've been testing this all over the place. Some tell me it's a Hungarian, others tell me it's Eastern Europe, and others, In other words, even in Mexico where we are, there are, apart from Spanish, there are many other languages, okay? And they are languages in their own right. And this story is also in that Mexican language, as well as, of course, in Spanish and other languages. And the beauty of this website, when you go there, you can also click and see the languages, the original script, like in the case of the Mexican language. And you can see the Arabic scripts, Indian scripts, and in some cases, they don't have the money, the resources, but the idea is that they want also to have the languages read in the different languages. So this is an upright revolution available now I believe, in 74 languages, you know. So you see these languages now speak a common language called translation. Yeah. Okay, can I? Education then should never lead to linguistic and cultural self-isolation. I want to connect to the world, but I don't have to negate my starting base first. I want to do so to connect to the world from wherever I am. Recently, I published another book called Secure the Base, Making Africa Visible in the Globe. I believe that the end of education is knowledge that empowers, that shows our real connections to the world, but from our base. From our base, we explore the world. From the world, we bring back that which enriches our base. That, it seems to me, is the real challenge in organizing knowledge and its transmission in an inclusive and balanced education system in the world today. We have to reject the notion that for me to be, others must cease to be. Reject the notion that my millions must be collected from a million poor. The splendor is not splendor unless it's built on squalor. That palaces are not palaces unless built on prisons. Education must cater for knowledge that empowers us to imagine a more inclusive palaces in our world. Thank you.